morning. A very long time ago, in the land of Israel, there was a famine near the town of Bethlehem. This was during the time of the Judges, which is a tumultuous time in the history of God's people in the land. It's a time where throughout the land of Israel in various regions, there would be these generational cycles of people who would grow up knowing the Lord and being faithful to Him, and the following generation that would grow up well off, but then would forget the Lord and fall away from Him into faithlessness and idolatry. There was times of invasions of enemy armies and kings and rulers who would oppress God's people. And then there were the judges. When the people would cry out, God would send the judges, who were these men, and in some cases women, who God would give the strength and the power and the fortitude to be the rescuing hand for their people. It was a tumultuous time. It was after the Exodus, after they had escaped Egypt together, after Joshua and the conquering of the lands of Canaan. But before there was a king in Israel, instead you have the tribes and their elders being in charge. And in the south of the kingdom, near the little town of Bethlehem, which maybe you know today from some other stories, but at this point in the Bible is really only known for a couple of really uncomfortable stories happening there. There's no song, "Oh, Little Town of Bethlehem," that sounds really beautiful at this point. Bethlehem is kind of a backwater where there are some things that people would rather not talk about that have happened there. And near this town of Bethlehem, there's a famine in the land. There isn't enough food to go around. And so this woman, Naomi, and her husband, they flee from Bethlehem into the land of Moab. This is a Canaanite land. This is a Gentile land. These are not Israelites. These are not Hebrews. But there was food there. And in Canaan, her and her husband had 2 boys, and those boys both married off. And then there was hardship. They fled from the famine into the jaws of death. Naomi's husband died. Naomi's 2 sons died. And they were left with Naomi and her 2 daughter-in-laws, Orpah and Ruth. Naomi, seeing that she has nothing else there, she's not a Moabite, this isn't her land, these aren't her people, she has no hope for a future here, decides that she must make the return to Bethlehem. She has heard that Bethlehem, which the town name literally means house of bread, is finally full of bread again, and there's food there. And so she decides to return, but instead of forcing her daughter-in-laws to return with her and to keep themselves attached to her, where she has nothing to offer them, she has no sons to marry them to, she has nothing to offer them, she releases them from following her. There's some protest at first, and Orpah and Ruth are both crying, and they love their mother-in-law. They desire to come back with her. But she insists. Orpah, well, she cries, and then she turns and leaves. Ruth clings to Naomi. And this is where we get the famous, if you've heard this line before, it's from the book of Ruth, "Where you go, I'll go. Where you stay, I'll stay. Your God will be my God. Your people, my people." Ruth is going into the great unknown here. They arrive back in Bethlehem, and really, truly, they have nothing to sustain themselves with at this point. But there was this system back in the days of Israel in the Old Testament. There was this system for taking care of those who had nothing that they could call their own, to make sure they at least had the food to put on the table to get by, and this is called gleaning. Have you ever heard this term before? Gleaning. And what gleaning was is that the workers would go through fields and they would pick the grains, but they were commanded by God to leave just a little bit still on the stalk, a little bit off to the sides. Essentially, they were commanded by God to be kind of messy and inefficient in getting the crops. And in this way, people would follow behind and they would glean for themselves. They would pick for themselves what they needed to sustain themselves and perhaps a little bit extra so they could sell it on the market and have a little bit of money. This is hard work. You're coming into the field after the field work has already been mostly done. You're following the workers, and this is in the Canaanite desert. This is hard, sweaty work. This is survival. This is sustenance farming. Subsistence farming. Many of you I've talked with, a lot of you probably come from a past of farmers in your family, right? You don't need to raise your hand, but in a Lutheran congregation, it's pretty common that if you go back 1 or 2 generations, almost everyone's a farmer. And sometimes there was days of great hardship. Imagine gleaning. Imagine having to make your living based off of the little scraps that you can get. But they don't glean just anyone's field. They glean the field of a man named Boaz. And Boaz is what we call a redeemer, a possible redeemer for Naomi. And this is a fascinating use of this word because when we hear the word redeemer, well, the first thing I think of is Redeemer Lutheran Church over in Spokane Valley. We use the word redeemer because we immediately associate it with a person in particular. And who is that? Not a trick question. The Sunday school answer, it's Jesus Christ, right? He is our Redeemer. He has purchased us with his blood, with his body, with his death on the cross and his resurrection. Jesus has made us his own. Boaz is a sort of a different Redeemer, though the idea is the same and it flows from the same idea. There was the system, a way of living back then where for someone like Naomi who is utterly destitute and has nothing that she can really call her own, that through her husband's relations, that there would be somebody who could claim the land of Naomi's relatives who have died, but by doing so, they also claim responsibility for taking care of Naomi. Essentially, the idea is that we are going to continue the inheritance of this man who died. But in order to continue that inheritance, you must take care of that man's family. Exactly the relationship that Boaz has with Naomi, it's never stated. The story in Ruth is fascinating because while most of the Old Testament is almost completely narrative with commentary given, Ruth is over half just dialogue. It's people talking to each other. It's very unique, and I think that's why we actually really love the book of Ruth, because it reads much more personal and intimate than almost any other book in the Old Testament. Over half dialogue. No other book in the Old Testament comes close to that. So we don't know the details, but we get a sense of who Boaz is. Now, Boaz is this redeemer, this relation to the family, and I, honestly, what I'm just going to say is you should read Ruth yourself this week. It will take you 20 minutes, and the Bible can tell the story a lot better than I can tell the story. But some of the important details here. Ruth shows herself, she's a Moabite woman. She is not an Israelite. She is a Canaanite. She's a Gentile. She's from people who worship false gods and idols. She is not a person who belongs, and yet she shows herself to be this woman of great work ethic, of great honor, of great fortitude, to the point where she's known in the town of Bethlehem and spoken of well. This Moabite woman, this foreigner, who is seen as this person of high value, this person of of great character, rather, I think would be a better way to put it, of great character, Ruth. And Boaz is interesting too, because Boaz is this land-owning guy who we get the sense of, well, he never says his age, but he talks about young men as if he's not. Later on in the story, he refers to young men, and it's clear that he doesn't consider himself part of young men. So he must be an older man, exactly what that means. Probably during that time, he's in his late 30s or 40s at this point, but he could be older. And Boaz is a land-owning man, but he's not married. He has no children, and this is an odd situation for him to be in. And it would seem, based off the story, that he just never had an interest in any particular woman to be married before. But guess who catches his eye? This foreign woman who is working in his fields. He takes steps to protect her and to make sure that she's guarded in his fields. And he takes steps to make sure that she has more than enough to feed herself and Naomi, and also to sell on the market. And Naomi and Ruth, they see this relation, and Ruth herself, again, we don't get to see inside the people's heads, but Ruth seems to be interested in Boaz as more than just a man who could be a financial rescue for her, but also as a man of great character. And there comes this dramatic moment in Ruth chapter 3. Again, read the book yourself, where Ruth forces the issue on Boaz. She uncovers his lower part of the body and sleeps at his feet in the middle of the night. And it is a little, if it sounds a little scandalous, it is a little scandalous. And I think our Bible maybe dresses it up a little bit nicer than it was. But she does this to force this issue with Boaz. And says to Boaz, you are a redeemer for Naomi. You are my redeemer, so redeem. And Boaz, taken aback by this woman of great boldness, of great character, a woman who he seems to have a little bit of his eye on, sets things into motion to make it happen. And this is where we get a little bit of last-minute drama in the story that unfolds a little bit clunky because we're not so familiar with how these Old Testament laws worked. But Boaz, well, it's not clunky in the telling, but it's clunky in my understanding of how it works. Boaz is not the first in line to be the redeemer for Naomi. He's second in line. There's another man in town in Bethlehem who would be first. And this is a bit of a concern because who doesn't want land? Right? Especially when you live in a farming economy. Who doesn't want land? And there's land attached to being this redeemer. But Boaz sets it up in such a way that well, I'll just tell it as I tell it. After Ruth does this thing, sleeping at his feet, Boaz goes to set into motion the chance to be her redeemer. And he calls 10 elders of the town together, and he calls the man who would be the redeemer before him. And it's kind of funny because in the Bible, when you read it, when he addresses the man, he says, "Hey, friend." Have you ever been in a situation, perhaps today at church, where you're talking to somebody but you forget their name? And you might say, "Hey, man," or "Hey, you." Well, this is the ancient Hebrew way of doing that. Friend is the term that they would use when you forget someone's name. Now, I don't think that Boaz did not know this man's name. It's a small town of Bethlehem. What I do think is happening here is that the story, the author, whoever's writing Ruth, doesn't want to reveal the man's name because of how the negotiations go down. They don't want to paint him in a bad light. So they're just kind of putting the placeholder name in there for him. So what happens is Boaz says, "Hey, so just so you know, there's this piece of land attached to Naomi, and you would be the redeemer before me in this line. So, if you want to redeem it now, because if you don't, I will." And the man at first goes, "Yeah, that sounds really good. Land? All right. I'll take that." And then Boaz pulls out, and I think this is why he's intentional about it, and then he pulls out the little catch here. And he says, but the day that you come into possession of the land, you must marry her daughter-in-law, the foreigner. He really highlights the foreigner, the Moabite, the woman, the Canaanite, the Gentile. You must marry her. And then all the children you have with her will become part of the inheritance. And the man says, what am I going to do, crash my inheritance for this strange woman who I don't know? You take the land. The man already has a wife and children. He probably doesn't want to go home and tell his wife that he made a deal to marry another woman that day. I imagine is certainly part of the drama here. And he doesn't want to split his own children's inheritance with this other woman who he's never even met and her any possible future children. And you could just tell Boaz is like, yes. And then we get to the part today where he says the deal has been made. There's this interesting thing where instead of shaking hands on it for a deal or writing a contract, they exchange sandals. It's because your footwear, they think it's because your footwear is on the ground constantly. So it can symbolize earth, it can symbolize ground. So there's this exchange that happens, and then we get to where we are today, or in today's chapter, where it ends with the happily ever after, sort of, right? Ruth and Boaz come together. There's a child. And this is a couple of things I want to end this story on. One, Ruth is definitely the heroine of the story, right? She is the one who you're invested in and you're proud of and you love watching her go. Boaz is the other hero of the story. He's important in the steps that he takes. But really the story is actually about Naomi. The story starts with Naomi's desperation and emptiness and ends with Naomi's fullness and redemption that she receives. In fact, at the very beginning of the book of Ruth, it says that Naomi went down, there was a famine in the land, and so Naomi goes down to this land of Moab. And the way that sentence is structured, it's written exactly the same as the story that happened in the book of Genesis. Abraham. There was a famine in the land, and so he went down to Egypt. Readers of the story, maybe not us, but readers of the story back then, would be very familiar with what happened with Abraham in Egypt. He ran into a little bit of trouble, but then he came back a rich and wealthy man, and it literally says he came back full from Egypt. And so you expect Naomi, there's a famine in the land, she's going into a foreign land, you expect her to come back full, but it literally says she came back empty instead. Deprived. But then the story of the book of Ruth is how God is in the background orchestrating these things so that by the end of these short 4 chapters, we see Naomi holding a child in her hands and the woman in town saying, Naomi, you have been blessed more than if you've had 7 sons through this one daughter-in-law. Sons are already the preferred, not preferred, but sons are the child that you really celebrate having in this time. And 7 is a special number. So when the women are saying, like, Naomi, this is better than 7 sons, they're saying, Naomi, this is better than perfect. Ruth, in this child that you have, Obed. The other thing I want to point out, in the last story, in the negotiations between Boaz and the friend, the man who shall not be named, the man is interested in being a redeemer because of the land and the wealth that he can get through it. That's why he wants to be a redeemer. He wants to redeem the field for his benefit and for the benefit of his children. Why is Boaz interested in being a redeemer? I would bet you that Boaz would give up the field to have Ruth. Boaz is interested in her. She is the crown jewel for him. And in this way, the story is telling us the heart of what redemption is. For God, you are the one that he has sent Jesus Christ to redeem. And he does it to redeem you. And I know this is something that we've talked about. I know this is something that we say, and I'll say it again till the day that I die. But I think this story helps emphasize the emotional depth of what God is doing through redemption. What Boaz does for Ruth is but a shadow, is but a foretaste of what Jesus Christ does for you. Jesus knows who you are, and he has paid everything to redeem you. You are that jewel that Jesus sets to redeem. You are the star in his eye. Doesn't mean that you're not a sinner. Doesn't mean that this is because you're perfect. It's because of God's love. It's because of God's grace. It's because of what Jesus cares for you. The book ends with a little commentary, but it's very important for us to hear as I wrap up here. It says that the son of Ruth and Boaz is Obed. And Obed is the father of Jesse, and Jesse is the father of David. David, the king of Israel, the great king of Israel. But more importantly for us, David. Who is Christ called the son of? The son of David. This is God's redemption story folding out just a little bit, and I think it's fascinating that one of the background stories that we get for David, for King David, is this story of a foreign woman being redeemed by this Hebrew man. And in that we see a foretaste of what God is going to do through Jesus Christ, the ultimate son of David, that he will redeem not only his people, but all the people of the land through this son. So join me in a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we give you thanks for your Son, Jesus Christ, who is our Redeemer, the one who set aside all because we could not attain equality with God, but instead Jesus has humbled himself for us so that we may receive forgiveness of sins, life everlasting, renewal, and recreation. We ask that this week that you would bind our hearts and minds to your Son, Jesus Christ, our Redeemer, and in all circumstances, good and bad, light and dark, righteous and evil, that we would call upon him and look to him as our hope, as the one who brings hope out of a hopeless situation. Pray these things in your Son's name. Amen.